on Magic Island 2. Port-au-Prince, Haiti, 1962. It's been 30 years since the incident with Dr. William Halperin and the evil Caplata Marie Garcelle. Well, that is long forgotten now, and time moved on. Things have changed, some for the better, some for the bad. But that's change, and change is always inevitable. Now we go to March. It's Carnival season, as everyone on the island is dancing, singing, having a good time, big floats. It's an endless party. A tradition that dates back all the way to the colonial period when Haiti was known as Santo Domingue. And now we join a American film crew that's down there filming footage for a newsreel. They are 30-year-old Roy Collins, 31-year-old Donnie Jacobs, 29-year-old Tony Erickson, 27-year-old Mike Dobson, and 34-year-old Joe Epstein. And they're there getting the newsreel footage for an American news agency that was requesting film footage for Carnival in the Tropics. And of course, Epstein, being the founder and CEO of the film company by the name of EduFilm, decided to take the assignment, and he brought his small film crew and his only employees down to Haiti to film it. Well, they walked the streets with Roy holding the giant camera and Donnie holding the boom mic to record everything. It was fun. It was festive. As they were recording, they stumbled upon an outdoor stage show where a local man in a straw hat was playing his African drums at a very fast pace. And on the stage was a very beautiful young black woman who was doing motions with her hands and then began doing some bizarre rhythmic African dance to the drum beat. Well, the film crew got a very nice spot where they had the perfect view of the stage, and Roy was recording the dance. He was quickly taken by the exotic beauty of the young dancer. He was almost falling in love with her instantly, like an arrow that hit him. Then he zooms in on her as she was still continuing her dance. She had noticed Roy was recording her, and then she let out a smile, and Roy smiled back. Then the dance was over, and everybody clapped in the audience. Then Roy says to Mike, "Hey Mike, here, take this camera," as Roy turned off the camera and gave it to Mike. And then he says to Joe, who's behind him, "You know, Joe, we should have brought colored film, man. It's such a beautiful spring day out here. Look at all these beautiful, festive, colorful costumes, and the audience back home is just going to see this in black and white." Joe says to Roy, "Listen, Roy, it's a film reel, not a documentary. So it didn't justify the cost of color film for maybe 2 or 3 minutes of film that's going to be seen at a movie theater." Roy says, "Well, you're right, Joe." And then he says to the rest of the guys, "If you need me, I'm going to be doing some filming of my own," as Roy was holding up his camera bag saying he was going to go take photos. Roy quickly runs over to the back of the stage where the young woman that was dancing was getting ready to leave, and then he breaks out his Argus C4 camera and begins snapping photos of her. She had quickly noticed Roy photographing her. Roy quickly puts down his camera and he says to her, introducing himself, "Hi, my name is Roy Collins. I'm an American. I'm here with a film crew filming Carnival for a newsreel." And then she says, "Pleased to meet you," in a heavily accented English. And Roy's eyes lit up and it's like, "You know English?" She says to Roy back, "Yes, I do. I also know how to read and write in English." Roy says, "Oh, that's fantastic." And then he says to her, "What is your name?" And she says, "My name is Esme Bisset." Then she extends her hands out to Roy and she says, "It's pleased to meet you, Roy Collins." And Roy shakes her hand and then he asks her, "Hey, Esme, do you know of a place where I can get lunch at? Since you're a local girl, I'm sure you know all the nice places where I can go and eat and maybe I could treat you." She lets out a smile. "We, Roy, I'll show you the best place we can get lunch at." And then the two walk off together. As they were walking off together down the street, Tony, another member of the film crew, points to Roy and tells the others, "Uh oh, guys, check this out. Roy's got himself a jungle bunny." The other guys looked and smiled and laughed and said, "Man, leave it to Roy," said Mike. "No matter what country we go to, he always gets himself a girl." And then Joe says, "Well, he better be back to the hotel before nightfall. We still have to film the nightlife here. Because I want to wrap this all up so I can start enjoying Carnival myself." All the rest of the guys agreed. Meanwhile, Roy and Esme were eating lunch at a local sidewalk cafe. It was a small, simple meal, and the two were just mainly talking, getting to know each other, as Esme was explaining everything about herself and Roy was explaining everything about himself. As the two were enjoying each other's company, then Roy noticed from his peripheral vision to the left of him that a man in a wide brim hat was staring at him. Roy turns around to look at him, and he knows the man was just a local man, middle aged, probably early to mid 50s, and he was just staring at them intently. He wondered who this man is. Then Roy is saying to himself in his mind, could it be her dad? Could it be an older sibling, an uncle, family member, or worst off, a lover? Then the man signals the waiter to come. As the waiter comes towards this man, then the man in the hat pays off the bill and then leaves. Then Roy gets back to focusing on Esme. Then Esme says, "Come on, Roy, I want to show you a lot of things around here." So Esme takes Roy on a sightseeing tour. And then as the day was starting to wane and turn into dusk, Roy says, "I have to get back to the hotel because I got to get ready to go out to a local nightclub. We got to do one more round of filming before we wrap it up, and then I'll spend more time with you because I'll be free since we're be done filming." Esme's face lit up with a smile, and she says, "That's wonderful." And she goes on to tell Roy, "I work at a local nightclub called Club Ombre, which is French for the Club of Shadows." Roy says, "Ooh, that sounds like a nice club. Maybe tomorrow night I'll go over there with the rest of the guys." She says, "Oh, that'll be wonderful." And then the two just looked into each other's eyes, and then they embraced passionately and started kissing each other passionately. And he says to her, "I'll see you tomorrow night, Esme." And then he breaks away from her and starts to move away slowly from her. The last thing he let go was her right hand. And then Esme just stared as Roy walked off. As Roy was walking down the crowded sidewalk, suddenly that bizarre man that was staring at him at the sidewalk cafe comes up to him, grabs him by his right arm, and he says to Roy with a stern voice, "Listen to me and listen to me good. Stay away from that woman. She's dangerous and she's going to cost you your life. The devil takes on many forms, including beauty." Then Roy jerks his hand free from the strange man and he says, "Hey, buddy, mind your own business." Then the strange man says, "I'm a friend and I'm just warning you. You're going to end up dead, or worse, you're going to have something that can't be cured." And then he walks off. Well, Roy shrugs it off, and then he makes it back to the hotel, where the rest of the guys were goading him, and Mike saying, "Uh-oh, it's Roy, and he's back, so how's your new jungle bunny?" Joe's like, "Oh, I'm glad you made it back on time. Hurry it up, man. Get ready. We have to go out to this club. I want to get this assignment done with." Roy says, "Fine, just give me a second to change clothes and freshen up." Well, Roy freshens up, changes clothes, and then they go out to a local nightclub, film it, and then call it a night. Meanwhile, at the Club of the Shadows, it was once formerly the Club Magique, which was owned by the evil Caplata Marie Garcelle, but since her death, it has fallen under new ownership. But there was still one man that was working there from the time that it was Club de Magique, and it's Louis. Now he went from waiter to maitre d', but there was something very suspicious about Louis. He still looked the same he did 30 years ago. He was greeting the people at the door of the nightclub and then assigning them waiters as they were being seated. Meanwhile, a Dominican tourist who was middle-aged was causing trouble in the nightclub. He was pinching the butts of the waitresses and just trying to start a brawl. Well, Louis comes up to the man and he says, "Okay, monsieur, you have been warned for the last time." Next to Louis was a big man named Claude, and he says, "Claude, get this parasite out of here." The middle-aged Dominican tourist like, "Hey, hey, hey, buddy, you can't talk to me like that. I'm paying good money here." Claude quickly punches the guy and then puts him over his shoulder and then throws him out the nightclub door. The Dominican tourist gets back up with a slight fumble and dusts himself off. Then he starts screaming obscenities about Haitians in Spanish at the front of the nightclub and then walks off with a slight fumble. He decides to take a shortcut through an alley. As he walks through the darkened alley, the only light was coming from the street lights on each end of the alley, barely illuminating the darkened alleyway. As he fumbles through the alley, he starts muttering more insults about the country and about the Haitians. Then he hears a bizarre crawling noise. Upon hearing that bizarre noise, he turns to look up at the direction where that noise was coming from, and from the top of the building, he was able to see them clearly. It was a group of men crawling down the wall like insects. They turned to look at him. Their eyes were glowing red, and their ivory teeth was visible in the dark. The Dominican tourist let out a scream, "Oh God, oh God, no!" And then they quickly leaped down on him and began to attack him. Meanwhile, back at the nightclub, a group of Jamaican tourists were enjoying the show. Well, they decided to leave. As they were talking amongst themselves, walking out of the nightclub, they decided to go down the same back alley for a shortcut, the same one that the Dominican tourists went down on. And as they walked, they saw in the poorly illuminated alleyway the vampires feeding on the Dominican tourist. Oh, they freak out and they pull out their knives ready to fight. But the vampires hop like grasshoppers and pounce on them and kill them all. Finally, the final victim, a Nicaraguan tourist. He was middle-aged with gray hair and very thin build. He was leaving the very same nightclub as the others, and he begins to walk down the street. He didn't take the alleyway for a shortcut like the two previous people that left before him did. As he walked down the street, unbeknownst to him, he was being followed from the rooftops, as somebody was walking on the rooftops of the building following him. Then whoever was following him via the rooftops began running on the roof and leaping off. But the figure doesn't land on the pavement. The figure begins flying as a rather monstrous bat chirp is heard. The Nicaraguan tourist freaks out. Then he sees a figure in front of him, and he says in his heavy accent, "Oh my goodness, you scared me. Don't scare me like that. I don't know this neighborhood very well. But as he was talking to whoever was in front of him, then he stopped. His face changed to the look of terror. Whoever he was talking to starting to frighten him, and then he starts moving back a little, and he says in a panicked voice, what are you? Oh my God, stay away, stay away. And he starts saying, no, no. Then he lets out a scream. Ah! That morning, the bodies were found, and the police, of course, were cleaning up the scene. As the bodies were being loaded into little station wagons being hauled off to the morgue, the lead inspector was writing in his notebook as a police officer comes up to him and says, Inspector Lafleur, they really fed well last night, he says to the inspector. And then he goes on to ask the inspector, what are we going to give as an excuse? Then the inspector says, that's easy. He says to the officer, the Dominican tourist was attacked by stray dogs. As for these Jamaicans, they all were killed in a gang fight. And as for the Nicaraguan tourist, he was mugged. Then the police officer says, oui, monsieur inspector, we will write it all down that way. And then he leaves. And then Lafleur looks around and then goes to the nightclub. He opens the door. The nightclub door was open, but of course it was broad daylight and everything was quiet. As he walks in, he sees Louis at the bar wiping the shot glasses. Louis says, good morning, Inspector. Come in for a little shot before you start work. Lafleur says, no, this is not a social call. This is just a warning, Louis, he says. I know you all fed well last night, and I'm just trying to warn you here. Try not to kill so many people. It gets very hard to find excuses how they get killed. Louis says, I'll pass it on to the rest, but I don't know if they're going to listen. You can't tell a vampire anything, said Louis. Then Lafleur says, well, I expect you to tell your friends about it because if they get exposed, we're going to have to go after you guys, and you don't want to screw with us, Lafleur says to Louis sternly. Louis says, okay, I'll tell them, but like I said, I doubt they're going to listen to me. Then Lafleur walks out of the club, and Louis walks behind him and locks the door. And then he says to himself out loud, oh, my goodness. I wish these people wouldn't be so reckless during Carnival. Well, the day of festivity finally turned to night, as the club was in full swing and there was a lot of people in there again. Well, Roy and the rest of the fellows arrived. Louis comes up to them and says, good evening, messieurs. Table for how many? He asked Roy. Roy says, table for 5. And we don't care where we sit at, said Roy. Then Louis says, messieurs, over here. And Louis sat them in the table that was near the stage. The band on the stage was playing the usual fare of tropical music. As the guys were settling down and enjoying it, a young, attractive waitress comes up to them and says, good evening, fellas. I'm Clarice. I'll be your waitress for the night, she says in a heavy, accented English. Then she gives them all menus, and she says to the guys, when you're ready, I'll be back in the few to take your orders. The guys acknowledge, and Clarice walks off. Then Mike asks Roy, so Roy, is your jungle bunny here tonight? And then Roy responds back to Mike curtly, yes, she works here. She's a dancer here, and I appreciate if you don't refer to her as the Jungle Bunny in such childish ways. You sound like a kid in grade school, said Roy, as his curtness was starting to turn to a bit of anger. Mike says, geez, Roy, sorry, man. Liven up, man. It's Carnival. We're done with the heavy work. Let's just all enjoy ourselves, said Mike. The guys in the table agreed. Then Joe's like, dang it. Darn, he says. I'm out of cigarettes, he says. Then Donnie says, hey, Joe, I saw a cigarette machine by the restrooms right over there. Joe says to Donnie, thanks, and Joe gets up to go to the cigarette machines. As Joe reaches the cigarette machine, he saw that it was completely empty. A waiter that was passing by says, "Yes, monsieur, we've had a very busy day today." Then the waiter says, "Well, monsieur, there is a shop across the street that sells cigarettes and other tobacco products." Joe says, "Thanks, fella." And then he decides to go across the street to buy the cigarettes. He did not tell the guys that he was leaving the nightclub to get some cigarettes. Well, he goes across the street and he goes into the store. He finds a pack of local brand cigarettes, buys it, and then leaves the store. Well, as he was leaving the store, he only made it halfway across the street when he realized he didn't have a lighter. He says, "Dang it," and he turns around and goes back to the store to see if he could buy a lighter. As he goes back into the store, the cashier was like, "Oh, monsieur, what, you forget something now, monsieur?" he asked Joe. Joe's like, "Yes, do you sell a lighter here?" The cashier says, "Yes, monsieur. Let me go get the lighter. I forgot to restock. We've had a busy day, you know." And then the cashier leaves. Joe was waiting around for the cashier to get the stock of lighters. He noticed two men that were standing there that were smiling at him. And he smiles back and turns around to ignore them. Then the cashier comes walking back into the store. Joe did not notice that the cashier went to the store entrance and locked the door. Then he quickly restocks the lighters in front. He says, "There you go, monsieur. Pick any lighter you want." Then Joe buys the red Zippo lighter, and the cashier says, "That'll be 30 centimes, sir." That was 30 cents in American dollars. Joe then picks out the coins and puts them into the palms of the cashier's hand, and the cashier says, "Have a good night, sir." As Joe goes to the exit of the store, the door was locked, and he says, "Hey, fella, why is the door locked?" Then the cashier says, "Well, we closed kinda early," he says, with a big sinister smile on his face. And then Joe, getting very suspicious, turns around and notices that the two guys that were smiling at him moments ago were now right behind him. And then Joe's like, "Oh, geez Louise, man." And then he decks one in the face and decks the other one in the face. Then the cashier quickly leaps over the counter in front of Joe and he says, "Well, monsieur, you put up quite a fight, but it's too late." Joe notices the cashier's eyes were glowing red, and he suddenly had white ivory fangs. He was a vampire, just like in the movies he used to watch when he was a kid, and he says, "Oh, great." Then he notices that the two guys he punched were back up from the floor, and they both also had red eyes and glimmering white fangs. Joe's like, "Stay away from me. Stay away. I'm an American. You can get in serious trouble." The cashier says, "So, monsieur, no one's gonna miss you." And then the three men lunge on Joe, bite into him, and drain his blood. After the feeding was over, the cashier tells the other two vampires, "Quickly, let's dispose of the body. I have to reopen up. Let me put a sign that says I'll be back in 10 minutes. Well, back inside the nightclub, the dancing was dying down as they're about to begin the next show. Then Louis gets on the microphone and he says, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we have an exquisite show. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the finest dancer of all the island. I present to you Esme Bizet." Soon the lights darken and Esme appears on stage wearing a very beautiful yet unusual dress, as the music that was playing had a more African beat to it. She started dancing around and just putting on the most elaborate dance show that Roy's ever seen. The show was over and the nightclub became bright again as everybody began clapping. Soon, everybody began to get up and get ready to dance again. Well, of course, Joe's little prolonged absence didn't go unnoticed, as Mike says, "Hey, Roy, I'm gonna go look for Joe. I don't know what the hell's keeping him. It can't be hard to find a cigarette out here." Then Roy says, "Okay, Mike, just be careful. I don't want to go out looking for you too." Mike's like, "Come on, Roy. We've been through a lot of tough areas together. I know how to take care of myself." And Mike gets up and leaves. As Mike got up and left, then Esme comes up to Roy. She says, "Did you like the show, my dear?" Then Roy says, "Yes, it was so enchanting," he says to her. She lets out a big smile and she says, "Oh, I'm glad. I did it specially for you," she said. Roy lets out a big smile, and then some slow music was playing, and then Roy says, "Esme, may I dance with you?" Esme says, "Yes." She and Roy go out to the dance floor and begin to do a slow dance. A bizarre song called "Under the Cherry Moon" was playing. The band that was on stage just mainly consisted of a bongo player, a guitarist, a vibraphone player, and a piano player. The song was very nice. It was a perfect song to dance with, as the lyrics were rather odd, as the song said, "I want to be with you tonight under the cherry moon." As Roy and Esme were slow dancing to the song, Mike goes across the street to the store. He saw the store was closed with a sign that said, "Be back in 10 minutes," written in both French and in English. Then Mike was like, "Ah, dang it." So Mike decided to see if Joe was anywhere nearby. He decides to go down the alley to the back of the store. That was his mistake. As Mike goes, then he sees one of the guys throw something big. He thought it was a rug. He was throwing it into the dumpster. And then Mike asked the guy that was throwing away whatever he was throwing away into the dumpster. But, dear listener, we know what he's throwing away into the dumpster. And Mike asked him, "Hey, Monsieur, did you see a tall man, thin, blonde hair, and a thin mustache around here somewhere?" The guy says, "No, Monsieur, I didn't see him. There's plenty of guys that look like him that's wandering around here." Then Mike's like, "You're probably right. Well, anyways," he says, "I'm sorry to bother you." And then he was going to walk off when all of a sudden the man says, "Oh, wait a minute, Monsieur, wait a minute. I think I did see your friend. He came into the store earlier to look for cigarettes." Then he turned around when he realized he didn't have a lighter and came back inside to buy a lighter. And that's the last time that I saw him. Mike's like, "Well, thank you. I wonder where he ran off to." Then the man says to Mike, "Oh, I know where he ran off to." He says, "He's in that dumpster." Mike was like, "What? What are you saying?" "This is not funny," Mike says to the man. Then the man says, "No, monsieur, it's not funny. It's life. We had to feed." Then Mike saw in horror as the man began to smile and exposed his fangs, and his eyes glowed red. Mike's like, "What the Sam hell's going on here? What is this, Halloween?" All of a sudden, when he went to turn around, right at the alley entrance were the cashier and the other vampire right there, all of them with glowing red eyes and their fangs exposed. Mike's like, "Oh God, what the hell is this?" And then he warns the men, "You better keep away from me, or else." Then the cashier said, "Or else what? Your friend gave us the same threat." Mike began to run the other direction, but the three vampires ran and quickly leapt in the air and tackled Mike and began feeding on him. Well, back at the nightclub, the song was over, and Esme and Roy stopped dancing. And Roy asked Esme if he could buy her a drink, and she said, "Oh, yes." And so Roy and Esme walk up to the bar, and Roy says to the bartender, "Bartender, my lady would like And then he paused and he turns to look to Esme and asked her, "What do you want to drink, honey?" She's like, "I want some coconut rum," she says. And then Roy says, "Coconut rum." The bartender says, "Coming right up, monsieur." Then the bartender gives Esme's coconut rum. And then Esme asks Roy, "You're not drinking, dear?" Then Roy says, "No, I don't drink any alcoholic beverages. I am what the British would call a teeter-tooler." She says, "Yes, I know the term," she says to Roy. Well, as Roy and Esme were talking at the bar, Tony and Donnie were still at the table. Tony says to Donnie, "Hey, I gotta go to the men's room, I'll be back." Donnie's like, "Okay." As Tony left, then Louis comes up to Donnie. He's like, "Oh, monsieur, are you Donnie Jacobs?" Then Donnie says, "Yes, what's going on?" "Your friend, Monsieur Joe Epstein, wants to see you out at the store across the street. He's got into some trouble and he needs you to bail him out. It's just he didn't have enough money to pay for something. And he asked me specifically to come and get you." Donnie says aloud, "Huh, typical." Then he gets up from the chair and pushes it back into the table and he tells Louis, "Lead the way, monsieur." Well, Louis leads him outside to the back alley, and then as soon as they got out in the back alley, Louis smiles, showing his fangs, and his eyes begin to glow red, and he quickly turns around and surprises Donnie and attacks him, biting him in the neck and draining him of his blood. Back in the nightclub, Tony was exiting the men's room when Louis comes up and he says, "Excuse me, Monsieur Tony Erickson?" Then Tony says, "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" And then the maitre d' says to Tony, "Monsieur, your friend, what's his name? Donnie Jacobs, had a nasty slip and fall in the back alley. He went out for some fresh air and fell and hit his head hard on some garbage cans. He's bleeding badly. He called out for you." Then Tony tells Louis, "Take me to him, quickly." Louis says, "Follow me, monsieur." And Tony quickly follows Louis. Now there was only Roy left. Esme and Roy were still talking to each other at the bar. And then Esme says, "Well, monsieur, I would like to come back with you to your hotel room, but I'm sure you're sharing it with your friends." Roy was like, "You're right, I am sharing the hotel with my friends. So, your place?" he says to her, and she says with a big smile, "Oui, monsieur, come." Then, as they were getting up from the bar, then Roy says, "Oh, wait a minute, let me tell the guys I'm leaving with you." So, Roy walks over to their table. Their table was empty. Joe didn't come back. Donnie was gone along with Tony and Mike. He wondered where they ran off to. Well, he looks around, and then he figured maybe they're all at the store with Joe. And then he goes up to Esme, and he says to Esme, "Listen, babe, I gotta go find my friends and tell them that I'm leaving with you." She says, "Okay, I'll wait here for you," she says. Roy lets out a big smile, and he says to her, "I won't be long." So, Roy leaves the nightclub, goes across the street, and sees that the store was closed and the sign that said "Be back in 10 minutes" was still on the door. Roy says to himself aloud, "That's weird." Then Roy sees a man crossing the street from the alley that connected the store to another building. The man had a giant rug that he was carrying over his shoulder. He watched the man where he was taking that rolled up rug to, and there was a flatbed truck in the alleyway between the club and the other building. Roy figures maybe these guys have seen where the others had gone to. So Roy runs over to where the flatbed truck was at. There were men there also throwing other rugs onto the flatbed truck. And then Roy was kind of curious, what's going on? What's with all these rugs? So, his curiosity getting the better of him, Roy went to see what those rugs were. As he got to the flatbed truck in the back, he saw those were not rugs. Those were white bed sheets, and they were all blood-stained. Then Roy was like, what the hell's going on? He reaches over to one of the rolled up objects, and he pulls the sheet back to reveal that there was a dead body underneath there. And to top it off, it was the dead body of Joe. Roy freaks out like, oh, son of a... Holy crap, what's going on? He noticed that Joe was covered with bite marks, and his flesh was gray. It was that noticeable under the pale lighting of the alleyway. Suddenly, Roy was confronted with several of the local men, and all their eyes were glowing red, and they smiled, exposing their vampiric fangs. Roy was like, what the Sam hell's going on here? What is this, a bad dream? A bad joke? Suddenly he heard a familiar voice behind him saying, you were not supposed to see none of this, said the familiar voice. Roy turns around to the direction of the voice, and emerging from the side of the flatbed truck was Esme. Then Roy says, Esme, what's going on here? You know about this? Esme says, yes, I know about this. This has been going on for a very long time, she says. And you were not supposed to know about this, she says to Roy. She says to Roy, now, Roy, I'm going to give you a choice. You could turn around and forget what you saw here. Or, if you're going to go to the authorities, they're not going to believe you. They're in on this. But she says to Roy, you could come back with me to my place, and we could sit down, have tea, and I'll explain everything to you, she says to him. And she goes on saying to him, and I promise you, no harm will come to you. Then she says to him, and I'm also sorry about your friends. Roy was like, what do you mean, my friends? Joe's not the only one dead? Then someone says to Roy, yeah, we killed all of them, you blank. Roy's like, Jesus God. Stay away from me, he says. Stay away from me. I'm an American. You lay a hand on me, there's going to be severe repercussions, he says. As the vampires were getting closer to him, suddenly Roy hears a loud snap of a whip. And the vampire that was in front of him, head comes flying right off. The other vampires look to see what caused the decapitation of their friend. And to everyone's surprise, it was that weird middle-aged man that harassed Roy the day before. He was there, and he had a whip that had blades on it. Then Esme shouts, it's Gene! Get him! Then the other vampires run toward that weird middle-aged man. Now we know his name, Gene. But this man was strong, and he knew how to fight. He quickly swung his whip around and cut one vampire across his face with it, and then swung again and cut another vampire's face with it. And the other vampires got dangerously close to the man, but the man quickly reached in for his pocket and pulled out some sort of small bottle and flung some powder in one vampire's face. The vampire screamed as it was starting to eat his face like some sort of corrosive chemical, and then he flung it again into another vampire's face, and the same thing happened. Then he runs towards Roy and Esme, and he quickly flung the rest of the bottle at Esme. It broke on her, and all the powder got on her and started eating into her skin. Esme lets out a scream. Then the man tells Roy, come on, come with me if you want to live. Roy follows the man out of the alley. They run what seems like forever. Later, at a building in a back alley, Roy and the man was safe there. Roy noticed that the building was used as a voodoo temple, and the man finally introduced himself. He says, my name is Jean Arnaud. I'm a local Hooligan here, and I've been battling these vampires for years, he says to Roy. Roy introduces himself, and he says to Jean, I can't believe this. This is like a bad horror film. Then Jean says to Roy, I wish it was like a bad horror film. I wish this was all fake, but this is not, he says. This is real, and this has been an ongoing problem for years in this part. And he goes on to tell Roy, and the authorities know about this, but they refuse to do anything about it. All they do is cover up their messes. And he says to Roy, and Carnival is their biggest feeding season out here. Roy's like, I can't believe this. So the cops know about it, and they don't do nothing. Typical, says Roy. Then Gene went on to explain to Roy about Esme, and he says, "Oh, your lover, Esme? Esme Bissett. She's a very old vampire, and one of the most powerful ones. She was created by black magic," said Gene. And he goes on to tell the story of Esme. He says to Roy, "Esme came from a very powerful and prominent Haitian family that made a name for themselves during the Revolution," said Jean. "And she came from that family. They were big supporters and generals under Henry Christophe." Then Roy says to Jean, "Well, that's interesting. So when does the vampire part come in?" Jean says to Roy, "I'm getting to that," sternly. And he goes on to explain to Roy, "Well, she was a very ambitious woman that craved power at any cost. And she had an aunt that was a prominent mambo. And, of course, she learned everything from her aunt, including some forbidden and long forgotten stuff about voodoo, namely a ritual called the Invocation of Shadows. And she used that to make herself into a vampire," said Jean, and he explained how the ritual goes. He says to Roy, "The ritual goes that they need a child to sacrifice. And with the sacrifice, they offer it up to the darkest gods and the darkest spirits of the world, and in return, they get immortality, but at a price. They need human blood to sustain themselves." Then Roy says, "Vampires." Jean says, "Exactly." And Jean goes on to explain to Roy, "And we're going to stop them once and for all." And he tells Roy, "You stay here. I have a small room in back with a cot, and you can go and sleep. Me and some local men are going to the club in the morning, and we're going to kill them all once and for all. And in case that Esme's not there, we're going to take a nice trip to her castle." Roy says, "Castle?" Jean says, "Yes, she has a castle just about 3 hours drive north of here. It's called the Island Castle. It was built by her father, and the locals stay away from it. They know about it." Then Roy says, "Okay, then I'm going to sleep." As Roy was making his way to the back room, he remembered something, paused, and turned around and asked Jean, "Jean?" He answers Roy, "Yes?" Then Roy asks him the question, "Since they're vampires, how come they can wander around the daylight? I thought sunlight killed vampires." Then Jean says to Roy, "Well, that's a very big lie. Sunlight doesn't kill them, it just weakens them. They're as human as you and me during the daytime hours, and that's why they decide to sleep during the daytime. But when night falls, run." Roy says, "Interesting," and then goes into the back room to sleep. Well, as Roy slept through the rest of the night and through the early morning hours, Jean and some local men get ready to attack. Before they left, Jean showed him a weapon he was working on. He pulls the cover back and reveals these bizarre-looking makeshift guns, and he tells the men that these are air-powered stake launchers, that they will shoot wooden stakes out at the target, namely the vampires. The men were impressed, but there was only 10 of these that he made, and there was 15 men in this group. So he gets one himself and gives the remaining 9 to certain men in the group that Gene knew were good shooters. Then they made their way to Club Shadows. It was around 8 o'clock in the morning, and they go inside the club. It was empty. Some men were armed with the new weapons that Gene made, and some were armed with more traditional bows and arrows. And they also had gas cans with them, and they began pouring gasoline all over the nightclub. They also used the bottles of booze to aid in the burning of the club. Well, Gene and 4 other men made their way down to the basement. They were looking around and they saw a lot of caskets down there. So Gene and the 4 other guys who were with him quickly began pouring the gasoline around by the caskets. Then they began opening the caskets and shooting some of the vampires in there and the chests with the new air-powered stake launcher. But they didn't have enough steaks to finish the job, so Gene orders the rest of the guys back upstairs, and he takes out from his pocket a matchbook, then pulls a match out and ignites it. Then Gene throws the lit match onto the trail of gasoline on the floor, and it lights up. Within seconds, the entire basement was engulfed in flames. Gene runs back upstairs and he screams to his men in French Creole to light the fire, and one of the men quickly takes a matchbook out, strikes the match, and throws it onto the gasoline-soaked ground. And they all left the nightclub as the flames began engulfing the nightclub. After the men ran, then they made their way to Esme's apartment. Gene kicked down the door and they quickly go into the apartment. They turned it upside down, but they couldn't find no sign of her. Well, eventually one of the men discovers the secret switch that opened a secret door into a secret room, and there was Esme's casket. Well, Gene went and opened the casket and nothing. It was empty. She was not there. And then one of the men in the group says, she's probably at the island castle. Gene says, you're right, she's probably at the island castle. We go there. Today, I don't care if we get there at night. We outnumber her 15-1, he says. Then he tells the men that they're going back to the temple and get more supplies before they go off to Island Castle. Well, they made it back to the temple. Roy was awake and he asked them, so did you get all of them? Gene says, all except for one, Esme. Esme is nowhere to be found, says Gene, and then he says to Roy, I betcha she's in Island Castle, safe and sound, until we go there after her. Then Roy says to Gene, well, count me in. Gene says, no, you stay here. This is just a matter for us to take care of. I suggest you get back to the hotel and get out of this place as soon as you can, said the old Hungan to Roy. Then Roy says to Gene, well, okay guys, I wish you the best of luck. He shook all their hands and left. But it was just a little ploy. He was going to go to Island Castle himself. He was going to have to find a way to get there. So Roy goes back to his apartment and grabs some more cash. And he goes to a nearby shop and he bought a crossbow, several arrows, a hunting knife, and a flashlight with a map. And then he asked the store clerk, excuse me, monsieur, you wouldn't happen to know a place where I could rent a vehicle? The store clerk's like, vehicle? You want to rent a vehicle, monsieur? Oh, I can loan you a vehicle for 30 gourd. Then Roy says, okay, what kind of vehicle is it? Then the shopkeeper took Roy out back and showed him a 1951 Ford truck. And he says to Roy, it runs very good. I maintain it very well. Roy says, okay, I'll take it, he says. Then he gives the shopkeeper $30. The shopkeeper gives him the keys. And Roy starts up the old truck. Then Roy drives off in his long journey to Island Castle. The journey took him a lot longer than expected due to him getting lost and other problems, but he finally arrived to Island Castle, and it was nighttime. And he saw the castle ahead and drove across the roadway that led to the island. It was a rather beautiful castle that was now slowly rotting away. And as Roy pulls up to the castle, he turns off the engine of the truck and turns off the headlights. Then he walks up to the door and opens it. As Roy wandered inside the castle, he was surprised. There was electric lighting inside the castle, crudely set up, but it was there, and also made it easier for Roy to see. As he walked silently and quietly down the halls of the castle. He saw many paintings there, collected over the years, but there was one painting that he saw there that stood out. It was the painting of Esme from the 19th century, wearing probably one of the most beautiful and expensive dresses that money could buy. Then Roy kept on moving, holding tightly to his crossbow. He smelled the smell of death nearby. As he was wondering, the smell of blood was also starting to get stronger in the air. And to his horror, he discovered several bodies of men just lying on the ground and a pool of blood. Roy recognized those men. Those were Gene's friends that went with him on the vampire hunt earlier in the day. And it was there that Roy had discovered the body of Gene, his neck torn out, dead. The old voodoo hooligan had no chance. Roy's like, oh, damn. And then he grabs Gene's stake shooter and he goes further and further into the castle until he heard the laughter of a woman. And Roy shouts, "Okay, Esme, cut the theatrics. Show yourself." Then Roy hears a female voice saying, "I'm here." It came from behind him. He quickly turns around and shoots the crossbow. But there was nothing behind him as the arrow hits the stone walls. And then Esme showed up from the side and she says, "I'm here." Roy quickly turns around and she backhands Roy, sending him flying against the stone wall. He hit the wall hard and lost consciousness. When Roy regained consciousness, he looked around. He was still in the castle, but the question is where. As his vision adjusted, he saw bars. He was in the dungeon, locked up. And Roy says to himself out loud, "Just great. How the hell am I going to get out of here?" Roy looked on his person and found out that all his weapons were gone. And the other question in Roy's mind was, how long was he out? Well, Roy had to get out of that prison. And he looked up and down his prison cell until he saw a small hairpin. Roy then grabs the hairpin and uses it to pick the ancient lock on the cell. And eureka! It opened. He was free. So Roy now had to figure out how the hell to get out of that dungeon. So he wandered around, searching and searching, until he came upon a room where his equipment was thrown in at with the equipment of several of the other guys that were killed. So Roy grabbed the stake shooter and left the crossbow behind, and he grabbed his knife. And then he finally goes up the stairs. As he goes up the stairs, he finally makes it to the upper levels of the castle. The castle was huge, and Roy wondered to himself, where is Esme at? Well, he searched every part of that giant castle that he could. He could see from out the windows that it was still dark outside. Question was, what time was it? As Roy looked at his watch, he couldn't. His watch was broken from that fall. So Roy just kept searching and searching until he came to a big room. It must have been a ballroom at one time. And then he hears the voice of Esme. She says to Roy, "Welcome to my castle, Roy. Welcome." And then Roy turns around and he says, "Well, well, well, if it isn't the she-devil herself." Esme says to Roy, "Really, Roy? Really? Just a day ago, you were madly in love with me before you found out what I was. Now you find out I'm a vampire, and now you treat me differently. Why, Roy? Why?" she says to him. And Roy says to her, "Because you're a vampire, and you people are evil." Then Esme says to Roy, "Don't worry, Roy, your way of thinking will change soon." As she was getting closer to Roy, Roy was backing away, and she says to Roy, "Don't back away from me, Roy. Remember, I'm stronger than you. Look what happened to old Gene and his friends. Well, they paid for it," she says. And then she was coming closer to Roy, and it was then and there that Roy saw behind her an old grandfather clock, and it began to chime 6:30 in the morning. Roy realized that the sun was going to come up soon. Then it dawned on Roy, a movie that he saw when he was a kid, Nosferatu, and he remembered in the movie that the female character had offered herself to the evil vampire Orlok because she read in a book that when a vampire feeds, they go into a huge state of euphoria and then they forget time. And that's what happened to the vampire. Feeding on her, he forgot it was sunrise, and when he heard the roosters cockle-doodle doing, it was too late for the evil vampire and he disintegrated into smoke. So Roy decided to do the same thing. He drops the stake launcher and he gets down to his knees, and then he says to Esme, "Alright, Esme, I give up. Make me into a vampire so me and you can be together forever." And then Roy reaches for the collar of his polo shirt and pulls it to expose his neck. Esme lets out a big, wide smile, showing her fangs, and she says to Roy, "It's okay, Roy. The process is a little painful, but once you become a vampire like me and you will have plenty of time together." And then she goes up to Roy and literally sinks her teeth into his jugular. She begins feeding, and she was in a huge state of euphoria as she fed and fed, sucking his blood. Roy felt dizzy and dizzier as the blood was draining from his body. And then she pauses for a moment and says to Roy, "My God, you have a rare blood type," and then continues to feed. Then suddenly she hears the chime of the grandfather clock. Esme stops feeding. She lifts her head up and wipes the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, and then she looks in terror and she says aloud, "Oh God, 3 minutes to sunrise." And she looked out the window and she could see from out the window that the sky was already light and the sun was going to rise. And it was at that moment of distraction that Roy quickly grabbed the stake launcher, pointed it at her chest, and said to her, "Suck on this, bitch." And then he pulled the trigger. Being shot at point blank, the stake nearly went right through her completely, but it stopped part way, exiting the backside of her back. Then Esme falls back, and as she falls back, the stake that was sticking out from behind her back pops back out to the front, all bloodied and everything. And then Roy looks around the room and he sees some decorative axes on the wall. He grabs one of the axes and feels the blade. It was very sharp. Then he walks up to the dying Esme as Esme looks up at him and she says, "I can't believe it." Then Roy says to her in French Creole, "Au revoir, Renmin en pile." Then Roy uses the axe to behead her. Afterwards, Roy grabs the severed head by the hair, and he slowly walks out of the castle. He arrives to the beach by the castle, and then proceeds to throw the severed head of Esme into the water. After he did that, then he walks slowly back to the truck, starts it up, and drives back to Port-au-Prince, a bit raggedly since he was still dizzy from the blood loss. As soon as he arrives back to the shop where he rented the truck from, then he passes out. Roy regains consciousness at a clinic. He sees he had a bag of blood hanging in the IV pole above him, and the doctor comes up and says to him, "Ah, monsieur, it's good to see you alive," he says to Roy. And then he goes on to explain to Roy that it took 3 bags of blood to save you, and plus, you have a lot of luck, young man, said the doctor. You happen to have a very rare blood type called Lutheran type, and when we mean rare, we mean it's very rare, and we were lucky that we had the blood that could save you in the freezer. Roy smiles. "Thanks, Doc," he said. "How long have I been out?" he asked the doctor. The doctor said, "You only been unconscious for about 7 or 8 hours. Then Roy says, "Oh, that's good." And he asks the doctor, "So, when can I go?" The doctor says to Roy, "Well, first things first, there's a detective here who wants to see you." Then he says, "Inspector LaFleur, he's awakened." Roy sees Inspector LaFleur come up to him, and he says to Roy, "Greetings, Mr. Collins. My name is Inspector Pierre LaFleur." Then Roy says, "Nice to meet you, Inspector. So what's going on?" he asks the inspector. Then Inspector LaFleur says to Roy, "Well, Monsieur Collins," he says, "I understand you had a run-in with the old Hoonigan Jean and some vampires." Then Roy's like, "Yeah, I did. So what?" Then Inspector LaFleur says, "Well, Monsieur Collins, here's the official story of what happened to you. You and your friends came here to film a newsreel. Well, unfortunately, you and your friends had a run-in with a gang of criminals led by Old Jean, and your friends were killed by Old Jean, and then you were injured when you were trying to defend the lady you were dating, Esme Bissett, who was the owner of Club Shadows, who they burned down. You were injured in the altercation, and Old Jean was killed by the police. That is the official story, and that is the story that we gave the embassy about you." After LaFleur was done explaining, then Roy says, "That sounds good enough for me, detective." Then the detective says to Roy, "All right, Roy, just pack your things and leave this country, and don't come back." Roy says, "That sounds good to me too, detective." And then the doctor comes up and says, "Well, Roy, I think you gained your strength back, so I think you're free to go." Roy smiles. They quickly take the IV line of blood from him, put a band-aid on him. Roy puts on his pants, his shoes, and puts on his blood-stained polo t-shirt and leaves. Then he goes to the hotel, changes t-shirts, and throws the blood-stained one away, packs all his things, grabs his passport and plane ticket, and leaves. Like and subscribe. The end.